Ensure the will of the people is honored and that democracy is protected, election systems must be made so that software flaws or attempts to manipulate software are obvious to detect and protect against. This is the essence of the work of the open source security community. By creating open source election systems, these scientists have created solutions to a major worldwide problem. In open source voting systems, off-the-shelf hardware is utilized in conjunction with free general public license software for optimal results.
This is the future of voting technology. We all need to be looking for open source voting solutions, and it's time for us to be able to say to the legislature, to the world, that these are the systems that we require for us to accurately and transparently count certified vote. If you have financial constraints with an open source voting solution, you can drive those costs down so that they're manageable. Really, the hope for the future is that we can make democracy accessible to everyone.
Because this is open source, owned by the public, where we can get as many eyes on the software as possible. You have 100,000 eyes on something rather than one eye on something. You've got to have a tremendous amount more security. Voters can regain their confidence that when they vote, it's represented exactly the way they intended.
California Association of Voting Officials, or CAVO, was launched for the purpose of providing open voting systems for use in public elections, as well as to provide training and education to election officials. And it's anticipated that U.S. voters will someday be able to vote on their open source smartphones.
To vote for President Washington, say 1.
1.
To vote for Governor Ross, say 3.
3.
You have voted for President Washington and Governor Ross. Please confirm.
Cast ballot. It has to be open to the public. When you have general public license open source software, that means it's meeting the international standard for transparency. The hope for the future is to have full participation in our democracy and to have full voter confidence that the systems are working properly.
The disability community, open source would help them in the future, how being able to do it on an iPad or your smartphone.
It's kind of abrupt and in your face.
And he won't back down.
The fact is, you don't know how they count the votes because the dirty little secret of America is the software is a corporate secret.
Chances are, if you're an elections official anywhere in the U.S., you've heard of Brent Turner.
He speaks truth to power.
Fellow senators here vehemently against this particular bill.
Because the stakes couldn't be higher.
The 2016 election was hacked. I believe vote counts were changed. I believe the tally was not the way people voted.
And American democracy is in the crosshairs.
No one really knows who is out there. There's hackers all over.
As long as everything is done in secret and under proprietary terms, as Microsoft wants, the only people who are going to have access are people like Mr. Putin and his KGB hackers.
We see every dirty trick, every black op method imaginable. He's like a little pit bull. He's not going to let go of it.
Open the elections up so every member of the public can know exactly how his or her vote is counted.
It's true activism. It's the thing you do. Why? Because it has to get done.
This is a historic moment for our democracy.
After 14 years of rage.
It's like a freight train. Point them at a specific destination. Nothing's really going to stop them from getting there.
His moment has arrived.
We advocate for open source general public license, software, and elections.
He is a patriot, first and foremost.
I will not rest until we see the systems deployed nationally because all the votes have to count.
Brent Turner.
We give up on that. We give up on the nature of our Constitution and the nature of our state. And that's just as horrible an idea as I can think of.
The real activist.
What mighty crowd. How's San Francisco tonight? Welcome to the Mabuhay, or as it's properly pronounced, the Mabuhay Gardens, now known as the Fame venue here on beautiful Broadway in North Beach, San Francisco. I'm proud to be here tonight with a lot of my friends and folks that are interested in this issue of election system reform. Back in the day, of course, when we used to be in this particular venue, we would be listening to the smooth sounds of all the punk bands, from the Dead Kennedys to Black Flag to who knows who else. And of course, they've now made this into a nice meeting space, and we appreciate being allowed in to present tonight about an issue that is almost as important as music and rock and roll and punk stuff. It's our democracy, which I think everybody in this room, if you're here tonight, you're probably aware that our democracy is at issue currently because the United States, historically, and certainly since the days of Bush v. Gore in 2000, and then with the inception of the electronic voting systems in 2004, we've been noting the issue of an inability to obtain a vote count that inspires confidence from the general public. So we're working on that at the California Association of Voting Officials. We have some great people, panelists with us tonight. Please welcome to the stage Commissioner, San Francisco Elections Commissioner Chris Jordanek and Chief Technologist Brian Fox. Brian, if you could start us off with just a brief description of anything that you think was missing from the explanation about open source, so that everybody's got that foundational understanding, and then please just give a briefing about yourself.
Sure thing. Hi. Yep, I'm Brian Fox. I am a free software advocate and an early software author of open source and free software. Open source, let's go back a little bit from open source. I think everybody understands what a program is. That's something that you have in your computer, performs an action for you. It could be Microsoft Word, it could be Keynote on your Mac, it could be Chrome running on your Linux machine. Those programs, when you look at them, you can't, when you look at the actual data on disk, you can't really understand what it is. It's a pile of numbers, it's not very clear. So to create those programs, programmers such as myself and others write what's called source code. And that is a human readable, well, maybe programmer readable version of that software. It goes through a process called compilation or other types of processes, and that's how you get your final program. Now, proprietary companies such as Microsoft, when they create software, only the people that work for that company can see the human readable ideas that create that software. And in the early 80s, Richard Stallman and myself and some others felt that it would be better if we could share the ideas amongst all the programmers, the same way mathematical formula are shared amongst all the programmers. The result of that was a movement called the open source movement, in which people write software and make that software freely available for everyone to see and to use. The free and free software stands for free as in speech, not free as in beer. So that's kind of open source software in a nutshell. And the reason it matters so much in our election systems is if our election systems are being written in a proprietary way and everyone cannot look at the code that goes into the programs, then we can't validate that the software is doing what we think it's doing. It doesn't mean that the company making the software is malicious. They could simply be not as competent as they think they are. After all, everybody knows in order to create software, you have to create some bugs so that there are other people to debug it later. So having open source allows everybody who's capable of reading that source code be able to look at it, understand it, and say whether or not they think it's doing what it's supposed to do. So that kind of wraps that up. And I think I'll turn this over to Chris. Chris, you want to talk about yourself?
Sure. So I first want to thank Brent for organizing this event. I'm also very excited to share the stage with Brian. So I want to spend just a minute just giving you a little bit of background on myself. So I've been serving in the San Francisco Elections Commission for about 4 years, and for 2 of those years I served as president. And I got started in working on election issues over 15 years ago, primarily on issues like ranked choice voting and proportional representation which represent the full range of voter opinion much better than the systems that most jurisdictions in the United States use today, and also gives voters more choice and expressive power at the polling place. So, and also on the commission, a little over 2 years ago, I authored the resolution that the commission passed unanimously that asked the mayor and the board of supervisors to fund the open source voting project. And in a little bit, I'll give you an update on where that project is at in the city and how you can help. And then something else I'm doing is I'm chairing a technical advisory committee that the commission formed a little over a year ago, whose purpose is to kind of give advice and recommendations to the commission on what should happen with this project. And another thing about myself is that I'm also a software engineer, and I contribute to some open source projects, so I have a good understanding firsthand of what that process is like and all of its advantages. So
That's awesome.
Thank you. Thank you, Chris, and thank you, Brian.
do you want to say about yourself, or?
Please, Brian.
Well, I did mention that I wrote some software. Those of you who know about software might know what the bash shell is. That's something that I authored while I was at the Free Software Foundation. The bash shell is the way, if you have a Mac and you open up terminal, you're using the bash shell. If you're in Linux and you open up a terminal, you're using the bash shell. If you're on Microsoft and you open up PowerShell, that's the bash shell. So that piece of software is a great example of how open source and free software in general can spread to become the best possible piece of software that it can be. It's a piece of software that was written over 30 years ago. I don't really know of any others that were written over 30 years ago. Since I've been doing open source software, I've also been doing other things. I have a company that likes to invest in startup companies. We don't believe that open source is incompatible in any way with capitalism. I'm all for making a dollar, and I'm all for having those dollars be made using open source and free software. So that's mostly what I'm involved in these days.
Thank you, and to prove up that point, I think you offered to buy dinner after the show, right?
I'm buying.
Beautiful, I love that.
Yeah, for everyone.
Okay, great, okay. So let's get into the question and answer session, and then we're gonna just go through some of these questions and then open it up to the audience for your participation. First of all, for the both of you, and Brian, will have you start off. How easy is it to hack into the current election systems in the United States, and do you think that the last election was hacked?
Well, as I mentioned in the video, I do personally believe that the last election was hacked, and this was based on looking at the statistics that came out from the exit polls versus the actual vote counts that were there. It comes from knowledge of understanding how those systems are constructed. It comes from examining the evidence of the missing piles of missing paper ballots that were there, that were supposed to be there for us to audit the systems and so forth. The ease with which you can hack one of our current systems should be kind of self-evident. The current systems are built on software and hardware from about a decade ago. If anybody here owns a computer from about a decade ago with software on it from about a decade ago, it's probably riddled with viruses and you can't figure out why it won't run fast and so forth. That's because these older types of machines and older types of software are vulnerable to newer types of attacks. That's number one. Number two, people seem to think that if your machine is not connected to the internet, it can't possibly get a virus. That would be true if there wasn't such a thing as physical access. And when you go into a voting booth to vote, you have physical access to some of these machines. And then the information that's on those machines is brought back to other machines for larger tallying or other election type events. So it's possible for someone to go into a voting booth, install a virus on a voting machine, and then have that machine install that virus on other election systems in the back end. And so that's a big issue.
So I don't know if the election was hacked or not, but what I can say is that if there is no auditing taking place after an election, then we can't ever know for sure. And by audit, what I mean is a process where you take the actual paper ballots that voters cast their vote on, and then you do a hand count of that and check against the machine tally. and that's a surefire way of detecting whether or not the computers counted those votes correctly. And for jurisdictions in the country that are not using a paper ballot, all bets are off. There's no way to kind of go back and check to see whether those ballots were counted as voters originally cast. And one thing I'll say is that in San Francisco, the open source voting project is for a paper ballot system. So these would be for the software that would be running on the machines that actually scan and count the ballots, as well as the system that allows voters with disabilities to vote accessibly in the polling place, for example.
So we're seeing now a great push in some of the federal legislation, namely the Kamala Harris Lankford bill that's coming forward right now, a push toward paper ballots and audits, which of course the California Association of Voting Officials and all students and experts in this arena agree you must have paper ballots and audits. But the interesting omission in that particular bill is the failure to address the software issue. So just as an add-on, luckily Congresswoman Tulsi Gabbard from the great state of Hawaii has created her own bill, which not only addresses the need for a paper ballot and a proper audit, but also addresses the component of the software. Because the reality in the election cycle is that the initial counts are generated from a software program. So if you were to have a bad count coming from the software and then a passage of time before you get to the audit phase, even though some people find it incomprehensible that there would be bad actors within an election department, it is best practice to make sure that the initial count coming from the software via the open source is a secure count, and then you're matching that count with ballots that have enjoyed a proper chain of custody. The problem is if you don't have a proper count coming initially from the software because the software has been rigged to give a false count, a bad actor inside the Department of Elections, let's just imagine that could happen, that somebody with a political agenda could be inside there, then they could manicure the audit count to artificially conform with the bad software count. And so that is the reason for the need, the necessity of having a proper first count that actually tends to carry on down the line. Very rarely will you see the audit process actually change the initial count. It tends to just reconcile. So what we want is to make sure you have all three components, a paper ballot, and we'll talk about the paper ballot next. I want to ask Chris, we'll start off with, what your thoughts are on the best design for a system and what San Francisco is thinking about currently.
Yeah, so this is something that the Technical Advisory Committee has weighed in on a little bit. And so of course in California, by law, we need to use paper ballots. So of course there will be paper ballots. And the question is, what would the parameters around that, like how would the paper ballot integrate with the system? And for example, if a voter goes into a polling place, there are options where, you might give the voter a blank ballot, and then they'll insert that into a machine, and the machine would mark the ballot. That's called a ballot marking design. And another system would be where voters mark the ballot by hand, and then they insert it into a precinct ballot scanner, and that's sort of another possible design. And then the accessible device has different ways that can behave too, like whether the voter has to insert the paper or not. And these are things that really haven't been decided on yet in San Francisco. And I would like to give an update on where things are at in the city at some point. But currently, the city hasn't even decided to fund the project yet. So until that happens, the city hasn't really made any decisions on what that system will look like. One more thing I want to say, though, related to the issue of costs. And in addition to all the transparency around open source voting systems, there's huge potential for cost savings. And like in California, there was a state bond measure that was introduced last year that would have provided $450 million to counties across the state and to match money that counties spend. And if you were to total up the state funds with the county funds, it amounts to something like between $600 and $675 million for voting systems. And this is only in California alone. There's currently a federal bill that would, I think, provide about between $400 and $500 million to all states in the country, and which is just a drop in the bucket with the amount of money that states will have to spend. So if there were an open source voting system available, even if one county built it, that would be available for all states in the country to use, and it could dramatically decrease those costs and free up money for government to just use more effectively.
Voting design, I know you've been involved with that voting design.
Yes. The question about voting design. In case it's not obvious, I am a big fan of the Deckard design. In fact, my team created the design that was shown in the video there for the 2007 Linux Expo. And so in our design, a ballot is marked with computers, basically, and then the paper ballot is produced from that. The paper ballot has visual, something that you can look at and say, oh yeah, this is what I agreed upon, this is what I said I wanted to cast. And also there's a machine readable barcode, and that can be validated independent from the standard election counting machine. So you can take your paper ballot and validate it on a different location or a different machine. You can't take it with you out of the system because they don't allow that, which I still think is wrong. Separate issue entirely. So anyway, that's the core design.
And Brian, can you mention about when you talk about the barcode? Would that barcode have any identifiers of the actual person voting, which I know is a concern, and also would it eliminate ballot stuffing?
Right, so you end up with a single ballot. It doesn't have any identifying factors on it to say who cast the vote, which is why you can actually validate it and verify it on a different location. I lost the second part of the question.
Ballot stuffing.
And no, the barcode is a unique thing. You can't run it 10 times in a row and get 10 additional votes. You can just get the one vote that came out of that unique ballot. So in order to do this, you would have to be able to generate many more ballots, and that is something you'd have to do in a precinct in front of other people, is manage to produce a large number of ballots and get them run through a machine. So that's the issue.
Okay. Next question. What are your thoughts regarding the general public license? I know there's some controversy with folks that are creating what some consider redundant licenses with an open public license, and the difference. Can you explain some of the differences between Mozilla licenses and these different licenses that are maybe considered not as pure as the general public license?
Yeah, so I'm in favor of using the general public license. And well, for starters, let me explain what the general public license is in comparison to other open source voting or open source licenses. So an open source license is really just a document or a file of words basically explaining what rights the user of the software has. And there's sort of two classes of licenses. And Brian, you might be a better person to explain this.
I'm enjoying this.
Yeah, but so there's what's called permissive open source licenses, and the other category is called copyleft open source licenses. Now, a permissive license would mean that if someone were to take an open source code and make changes to it, they could make that a proprietary version of the software. But if the license is what's called copyleft, it means that the changed version also has to be open source. So it's permanently open source, all into the future. So the advantage of a copyleft license is that you ensure that any resources that go into building that software will be forever open source, for all future generations. And if this is going to be a project that taxpayer dollars is going towards, it really makes a lot of sense for that to be copyleft. Now, once you have this category of licenses called copyleft, then there's sort of like which license within that do you use? Now, the general public license is the most popular form of copyleft license, and Linux was using version 2 of that license, and then the newer version is version 3. And so the Director of Elections has stated publicly during commission meetings that he prefers using general public license version 3, and the commission supports that. The commission's resolution stated that we prefer copyleft licenses. So, so yeah, I think it's great. I mean, using a license like that would ensure that these systems remain open source into the future.
Yeah, great explanation. Thanks. And yeah, copyleft is the way in which we keep ideas shareable, and that's really the most important thing that happens inside of this type of free software. What we're creating is, as Brent likes to call it, publicly owned software, and it should be publicly owned. It's the software that we would be using to determine our future via a democratic process. I want to toss one thing in here which we kind of didn't talk about. Maybe you're going to get to it later, but people talk about hacking the vote, and they think of it as a large scale operation, but it doesn't have to be a large scale operation. A very small change in one location by one or two people can affect a massive outcome of a vote, especially with the current electoral system we have in place. So you can imagine that there's a precinct which predominantly votes Democratic, say, and then one person goes into that precinct and is able to cheat and make it look like, even though it voted Democratic, a lot more Republicans voted. And then when you add up all the Republican votes for the state, oh, there's more Republican votes than we thought we would have. So that's kind of an issue. I see there's a question, but right now.